Okay, thanks a lot for having me. Thanks a lot for the introduction. I'm going to talk about abstractive summarization for explainable claim verification. I think the way this relates to biases is that claim verification is very much connected with fact checking, and like if you have less fake news, you have less biases in the in societal discourse. If you make advances in claim verification, then you also make advances in fact checking, and this might help mitigate some of those. So I think this is how this connects to the conference. And it's quite a long title. I'll try to explain all of these parts in more detail during the talk. And lastly, this is kind of high level and a bit of my vision how to get to explainable claim verification, but it's not very technical. So I hope this is okay. Let's perhaps start with contextualizing where we are. This is natural language processing research. First, perhaps let's talk about fact checking. This mainly is done by human experts, and you try to assess the truthfulness of a claim. And this can be just a label, like PolitiFact does some labels, but it's mostly analysis. And this is quite a long article. Claim verification, on the other hand, just takes a factual claim and tries to predict its veracity, and that's mostly a score. The most popular data set is fever, and there you try to predict a score whether dependable evidence supports or refutes the claim, and from there you kind of make a statement about whether it's true or false. A claim in fever looks like Carrie Elvis was born in 1982. This is not as flashy as, I guess, fact-checking, but nevertheless, advances in claim verification would probably translate with advances in fact-checking. And then what you have to do is you have to find the good evidence which can support or refute the claim, and you usually do that from Wikipedia. And in the best case, your system takes this claim here, and then it somehow understands that it needs to go to the page about Carrie Elvis, and there the system finds that Carrie Elvis was born in 1962, and therefore, the system would refute this claim here. Now, claim verification just returns a score. There's a bit of a consensus that humans just don't like black box scores, but would rather prefer explanations. And so the way I think about explainable claim verification is that we want to create something which is similar to this analysis in fact-checking. There is great work in explainable fact-checking, mostly by Isabel Augenstein's group in Copenhagen. They have this paper generating fact-checking explanations, which I guess inspired me a lot. What they do there is they generate extractive summaries from a fact-checking verdict, and then they can show that this kind of serves as an explanation for a fact-check to human users. What I think is a bit unfortunate is that they do have that fact-checking verdict in the first place. And if you have this, then you can create a summary which serves as an explanation. But if you don't have that verdict, how do you start generating that extractive summary? Right, it doesn't really work. Now I argue in this talk, and I hopefully can support that with some evidence, that we should just go with abstractive summaries, and we're living in 2022. Let's use large language models to generate those. If we talk about summarization, I think most people in natural language processing would think, well, if you have summarization, you can either go extractive or abstractive. Like extractive is you have a source and then you would just extract phrases or sentences, and this gives you your summary. Abstractive is more like a sequence-to-sequence task, a bit like machine translation. You have your source and then from there you generate your summary, end-to-end mostly. And this is where my understanding of summarization stopped, like 2 years ago. But I, at some point in 2020, read this paper by Udo Hahn and Mani from 2000. So that's like a long time ago, the Stone Ages of NLP. And there they actually distinguish between different types of summaries, which I think makes lots of sense. Like, for example, you could have indicative summaries, that's basically semantic row labeling or an identity extraction. You can have informative summaries. This would be our intuitive understanding of summarization. It's just you have long text and then you have a shorter summary. But they also say, like, at some point in the far future, perhaps we would want to have critical summaries, which like take a source as an input and then they generate first an informative summary, but they also can add value by expertise which is not present in the source. Now this sounds a bit far-fetched. I argue that large language models to some extent can add this value. And I'll show some examples of this. Now, I think it's straightforward to see that the complexity of these things gets higher and higher the further down you go. And for indicative or informative summaries, you can just do extractive, I guess. For critical summaries, extractive summarization doesn't work anymore. So we probably should go with abstractive here. And then I argue that critical summaries are closest to the analysis in fact-checking. So perhaps this is what we should do in explainable claim verification as well. And if this works, this would also translate into automated fact-checking and explainable automated fact-checking. Now two questions. First, are they feasible? Like, I would say not quite yet, but they are clearly more feasible today than 5 years ago. And the second question, which is like open, is would they actually be useful to humans? And like in the rest of this task, I'm going to talk a bit about the feasibility of these and how I imagine them to look like. And in follow-up work, at some point, we have to investigate whether this would actually be what a human wants. 2 years ago, we published a paper called eFever, Explanations and Summaries for Automated Fact-Checking. This generates abstractive informative summaries using GPT-3 and a few-shot learning setup. Like, I'll just read out the first column. The first row here, we have a claim Marnie was directed by someone who was the master of nothing. Then we have an automated system which would go to Wikipedia and extract these evidence sentences where it says that Hitchcock was at times referred to as the master of suspense, and Marnie was directed by Alfred Hitchcock. And this is a bit verbose and perhaps, just too long for humans to be immediately useful. We can then generate this explanation, or rather this informative summary, that Marnie was directed by Alfred Hitchcock, who was the master of suspense, which I think is quite good, or I kind of like that. So what I'm trying to argue is that we can do informative summaries. Informative summaries are a subset of critical summaries. For critical summaries, we probably need some other stuff. I think I'm going to skip this graph. Like, this kind of shows that the informative summaries capture the relevant information. Now, this is work in progress, and it's about zero-shot reasoning for claim verification. We basically leverage the Let's Think Step by Step prompt addition by Kojima. And then if we would ask, given to provide the evidence, is the claim true or false, we have the Marnie claim again. And then we have the same evidence. And if we add Let's Think Step by Step, the model generates that the first sentence of the evidence says that Hitchcock was referred to as the master of suspense. The second sentence says that he directed Marnie, so it must be false because the director of Marnie was referred to as the master of suspense and not the master of nothing. I think this starts to get into a critical summary because we have concept zero-shot reasoning, which is not implicitly part in the source, but then we can still generate those. This is other work of mine where we investigated whether large language models can extract the implicit heroes, villains, and victims in media text. And basically, we just ask who is the villain in the following text. And do I have time? Yeah, yes, like please just take like 30 seconds to read this here. And I think the output is awesome.
While people read this, let me ask a simple question. Is this zero-shot reasoning, right?
Like not really. This is more like a question answering. Like we just add this prompt, who is the villain in the following text.
Yeah, but this is still zero-shot. I mean, you didn't fine-tune the...
Exactly, yes. Yes, this is all zero-shot, yes.
Oh, thank you, very interesting.
And then we would also add villain again with a column. And here we hit enter, and the thing in bold is the completion of GPT-3. Again, I'm trying to support the claim that large language models can add, like extract implicit framing and attitudes in such texts which are not explicitly stated. And I think these might be important to explainable claim verification because of framing is just important, and this is a method to get at the framing. Now, like large language models are just getting better and better. So perhaps in 5 years, you know, we like anything could happen, and we could have crazy good models which can make even more awesome stuff than the things shown here, and this might get quite close to critical summaries at some point. For now, large language models can create informative summaries. I've shown some examples of this. They can perform zero-shot reasoning in the claim verification setting. To some extent, it doesn't always work. This is a bit unfortunate. They can capture framing and attitudes. To some extent, this also doesn't always work, but that's just what it is. Other people have shown that large language models are actually knowledge bases, and you can like extract lots of factual expert knowledge from there. I think this is connected to critical summaries again, and they could also answer informative questions about the claim or evidence, which we have retrieved before. So I think they at some point might be able to generate such critical summaries, and I think this is a useful operationalization to get there, and I have to think about the whole thing. Now, what I'm proposing here is not too different from what other people have done. This is from the Claimbuster paper in 2017. I think the system is still running. Like they first monitor claims, then they have some sort of matcher and checker, and then they generate that fact check reporter, which is just lots of information. Like what I'm proposing here kind of is a different version of this information and how to generate that information. Like here, they would just take existing information perhaps from the internet. I would check, like I think it might be more promising to just generate everything on the fly with large language models. But I mean, you'd also have like all the other things in your pipeline as well, because you have to retrieve some factual evidence and so on. Now like all of this is a bit hand wavy, and there are lots of limitations. None of these are resolved. The first is language models are subject to hallucinating. This is a problem. Sometimes they just make things up. They capture lots of biases, and they might propagate such biases. So this would be very unfortunate. And there's a true QA benchmark, which basically tests whether language models answer questions faithfully, and they do not. In the majority of the cases, this is not great neither. There are also black box. There's a high computational cost. They don't contain true world knowledge, and they can only approximate reasoning, but they don't really have reasoning. They could also be used to generate fake news, critical summaries, which might mislead people. And like, how can we tell? So this would also not great. And then the open question still is, would they be useful to users? We haven't checked this yet. But like, this basically concludes my talk. I argue to let's tackle explainable claim verification as generating critical summaries, where a critical summary can be lots of different things. And I think we should use large language models and abstractive summarization plus some other, information extraction from those language models to generate such critical summaries. And then I also very quickly talk about limitations. And thanks for listening, and happy to take questions.